I want to start with enlightenment, okay, because it's one of the first things you mentioned, which caught my
Yeah.
eye. Um, we have this term enlightenment, which has kind of entered our vocabulary. That it was an enlightening experience. Okay,
Hmm.
could you perhaps talk a bit more about what enlightenment entails vis-a-vis the human psyche, and like what you're supposed to experience once you reach enlightenment, and number two, perhaps how you get there. So talk a bit more about the meditative practices rather that you refer to.
Sure. And I really want to preface this just by saying that for all the stuff I'm going to be talking about today, this is really my way of reading, Buddhist and Zen traditions. So you'll definitely get different answers talking to different people. Um, but speaking from my perspective, enlightenment is, as I understand it, um, I guess you could say the culmination of um, a sort of extended period of um, practicing these sort of religious exercises in a way. So the sort of primary thing that people think about with meditation is, or with enlightenment is meditation. And I think in terms of, going back to this idea of psychology, right? I think meditation has a lot to do with, so in Buddhism, it's sort of thought that one of the really core causes of suffering for people is this, what's thought of as the sort of deluded notion that people are separate from reality, right? So if we're talking about like ontology um, or it's like the idea that there is a separate self. This idea of me, Porter, being a sort of closed subjectivity, and the reason that causes suffering, according to Buddhists, is because it isn't true. There is actually no line that divides me as an entity from the rest of the world. We can draw that line, and like figuratively, we can think about life along in those terms, but it doesn't necessarily reflect an inherent reality. So you could say that enlightenment is what happens when and this is also part of the thing with meditation, right? Is you're sort of examining your own thoughts and you're examining your experiences until you sort of are able to perceive the sort of reality of not being separate from anything. And that's I think like where the sort of religiousness comes into it, is that that's sort of thought of as being a very sort of intensely like mystical or religious experience. And I think for a lot of people, it sort of has that aura around it. But it's, you don't actually have to think about it in those terms. Like there are a lot of people, especially in the West, who wouldn't call themselves religious, but they practice Buddhism, right? And then I think you asked about meditation, right?
I did, but could I just come off a point you made there
Yeah.
about, you mentioned not considering yourself to be separate from the rest of the world, right? Is
Hmm.
that correct? So in Islam, the main teaching is something called Tawheed, which basically means the oneness of God, okay? But another translation of Tawheed is unity, right? The
Hmm.
oneness of God, the unity of being. There's no, so when we get to the more mystical and practice, the mystical, fringes of Islam, you get something which is very akin to what you're talking about something called Wahdat al-Wujud, and it's something which I personally can't talk about with any authority. It's very, it's something which is experiential, I think, more than, and it's therefore, because of it being an experience that some people experience, I think this state of being one with the rest, not being separate from the rest of the world, or not being separate from the rest of creation. Okay,
Hmm.
so when they talk about this thing, and you find them saying things in poetic terms which are, if taken literally, are incredibly blasphemous, considering yourself to be, for example, one with God, right? But one considers one of the teachings of Islam is to give people the benefit of the doubt. So when someone says, there's a famous story of a poet, of a Sufi poet, right? Hallaj. He basically said, "I am the truth." One day, he was a poet, and and people were like, "Are you saying you're God?" Because one of God's names is Al Haq, the truth, the ultimate reality. And he said, "An Al Haq, I am the divine, I am the ultimate reality." He was executed. Okay, he was killed for this.
Right.
You know,
That sort of thing doesn't go over so well.
yeah. So you should avoid saying these things in public, even if you think that's the advice.
Or be very careful.
Who you say them to, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the reason I mention it is because there is, I think, becoming aware. If there is something more to the human being than just the physicals, if there's something immaterial about the human being, that immaterial thing, based on these experiences of people like Hallaj, other people that, you know, he's not unique in Islamic history, and his experience of Buddhists, that feeling connected to the rest of the world, like yourself being not being contained within your body. If that makes sense, that kind of idea, that's an experience that I think occurs within people who undergo spiritual exercises in the Islamic tradition as well. So there is a parallel, but again, it's very it's controversial. I'm not going to deny the wording particularly is quite controversial. But yeah, go on about the meditation, because I want to see why I can learn now. I think how to become like Hallaj but not get executed.
Right. Well, you know, first of all, I recommend just being very careful what you say, because, you know, I think that's sort of it's an easy to understand issue, right? Because you're sort of entering territory where you're having these like really direct religious experiences, right? Which, you know, that's I think in almost every religion that's something which is really kind of controversial, or if not controversial, like takes, you know, has a really high sort of level of expectation, and it comes with a lot of baggage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I completely understand. You know, and then as far as meditation goes, I think that there is, you know, there's so much you could say about meditation, but just in terms of what, you know, we've already talked about so far, there's this idea which, you know, there's this idea that in a fundamental sense, what you're trying to, you know, realize, and I mean I say that word not in the, you know, conceptual sense, but in terms of the you know, in terms of what you're trying to become, you know, you're trying to realize this you know, idea of enlightenment, which, you know, as I was talking about, has a lot to do with you know, the separation between you and the world. The idea is that this is actually how things are. You know, it's not like you're trying to change reality. Yeah, it's more like, you know, you can visualize it as like, let's say there's like this is something that, you know, it's a metaphor used in Zen Buddhism a lot. You know, let's say you have like a mirror, and it has like a lot of cracks on it, as you can see my phone does. And maybe it has a lot of smudges and maybe some grime accumulated. Which
yeah. Can I guess what you're gonna say?
Go. What do you think?
Is it trying to clean the mirror so you reflect reality or something?
Yeah, yeah. So
okay.
like you're instead of like changing the image that you're trying to see, the idea is that you're actually going back. You're kind of like trying to return to what things fundamentally are. You know.
Right.
So as far as what meditation is like, you know, I think it's emphasized in a lot of, and meditation is something which really differs. That's one of the most fundamental thing which changes across the different traditions, right? But I think what a lot of them emphasize is, yeah, like instead of like really filling your mind with like trying to change your mind by like trying really hard to make it into some way that you think is correct, right? Like And I think that when I think about that, I think back on how I used to think about like morality, and like, oh, like when I was a teenager, I was like, I just have to try really hard to be a better person. Like, like you have some ideal and you're trying to change it directly. I think in a lot of Buddhist meditation, it's more like clearing your mind. So finding ways to actually like remove a lot of the clutter, which sort of fills up the mind. Yeah, going back to this analogy of the mirror, you're sort of trying to remove anything that's obstructing the way that you're thinking or your experience, so that you can more kind of directly perceive this idea of like oneness.
Okay. That's,
Um,
can I ask a question? So you
yeah.
mentioned the goal is to go back to something, right? To go back instead of changing yourself, to go back to perhaps what was, you didn't say this, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what we originally were, what we're supposed to be. Would you agree with that?
Or maybe what we already are but don't realize.
Okay.
So like it isn't you actually like, and I think that's an important thing. Like, um, and again, this is a very Zen way of saying this, but like the idea is that you actually already are this thing. Like there's this saying in Zen Buddhism, like, oh, meditate like you're already enlightened, and like you actually, so yeah, it's not even like you used to be. It's like you actually already are, and you're sort of just like trying to wake up to that reality. Yeah, waking up is another word used a lot.
Interesting. Okay. There's this book by a so in the Sufi tradition in Islam, you have you have books which talk about this different stages of the spiritual journey. Okay, so and in this book it's called Manazil as-Sa'irin. So basically the stations of the people who are journeying towards the ultimate reality. The
Right.
first stage, the first level on this is the stage of waking up, is the stage of wakefulness, when you awaken to the reality that there is something, that you're going somewhere, that there is something to work towards, I suppose. And then there are 100 stages in this book. Each
Yeah.
Sufi, I think, has their different variations, but the first stage is the stage of wakefulness. I think if I want to look at what you're saying, using Abrahamic terminology, I suppose, when you say, I found it really interesting when you said, you already are that thing which you're aiming for, right? So
Mm.
in the Abrahamic traditions, you have this idea that the human being is created in the image of God. So it's
Mm.
great. What that means, the best answer I found for that is with the mystical tradition, right? This is a tradition which exists in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad as well as in the Bible. It's not in the Quran, but the Prophet Muhammad did mention this.
Mm.
Adam was created in the image of God. So what is believed is that the human being has this divine potential, and
Mm.
that always exists within the human being. And like you're talking about the mirror and rubbing it and cleaning it, polishing it, and reflecting
Mm.
uh, better that inner reality. That's what sin is basically. Sins are things which kind of cloud that
Mm.
in the Islamic spiritual tradition. And once you clean them, you can overcome your lower self. You awaken that inner self, I suppose. And you awaken that inner level of. So you have different types of knowledge, right? You can acquire knowledge in different ways. You can acquire knowledge through empiricism, like I see something there, therefore I believe it to be there. I
Mm.
can logically think of something. I can, maths is one of those things.
Yeah.
Uh, I can logically work things out without necessarily having to perceive them. But then there's a third type of knowledge, which which religious traditions, I think, all kind of believe in that there's this intuition, there's this
Mm.
metaphysical intuition which exists, which you can gain access to
Mm.
through, I suppose, what in Islam you'd call purification of the self. And
Yeah.
it's very similar to
Yeah.
yeah.
It's so funny. Also, when you were talking about these different stages of like spiritual on the spiritual journey, like coming from an Islamic context, it just sounded so similar to like just formulations in Buddhism that I've heard. So yeah, that it's cool seeing these parallels.